All right, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm excited to share my paper with you guys today. I've done a lot of late night studying of this last night, so I'm excited to talk about it a little bit more. Just by a raise of hands, does anybody know anybody with hearing loss? Oh, yeah. It's yeah, very common, very common. So to start out, I wanted to share a story. About 2 years ago, me and my wife lived with my wife's grandma, who she was losing her hearing. She is still losing her hearing. But one night at 3 a.m., the fire alarm went off. And there's a certain feeling that you get when the fire alarm goes off at 3 a.m. It's like, I know I'm supposed to get up, but I didn't want to get up. Anyways, I got up after a few minutes. Grandma was confused out of her mind. She didn't know what was going on. Her hearing was gone, and so she could only partially hear it. Anyways, it got me thinking a lot about what are the some of the extended problems with hearing loss. So when I came across this article, I thought it was a really good one that kind of played into what I was interested in as being in industrial hygiene, and also just kind of examining where noise extends into the workplace other than just hearing loss, other than just, we know some of the health effects that we'll get into later, but I thought that this was interesting. Um, Disclosure up front, what I used for artificial intelligence. When I heard that this year we were going to focus a little bit more on using artificial intelligence, I will admit I got a little excited. I think it's fun. I enjoy working with artificial intelligence. I wouldn't call myself an expert in any way, but I'm excited to see what it can do. So I kind of pushed it to its limits. I tried to for this and see what could happen. So to start, I used ChatGPT to generate some article ideas for this assignment for this presentation. I asked it what would be some good articles, and we'll get into that in a second. And then I have a few AI generated slides through Gamma. You'll recognize those when they come across. They look a lot better, but once you start to look close, then they look really weird. And then I also asked Chat to develop some discussion questions, and we'll get there in a sec. So when I first started looking for an article, I went to ChatGPT. Some of you guys may recognize this as just the home screen. And then I went to this Explore GPTs on the top left, which I thought was new, and I hadn't ever explored that. And sure enough, when I did that, I found right there, number 4, Scholar GPT, Chat GPT that explores different articles, says 200 million different resources. I thought that was perfect. So what did I do? I copied and pasted the instructions off of the Rocky Mountain website. I said, hey, this is what I've been asked to do. And then at the end, I forgot to put an enter right there. I said, suggest 5 different articles with a summary, the strengths and weaknesses, and 5 discussions questions. So this was number 5 that came up. Something that was difficult. I tried like changing things around. I would ask it like, hey, do this instead, or I'm more looking for this. And it kept giving me the same articles. So that was kind of annoying. And you can see the discussion questions aren't the best. The first one is, how does noise exposure increase the likelihood of workplace injuries? That's like, I don't know, a 3rd grade quiz question, not kind of what we want here. So I had to push it for something a little bit better. But so that's kind of what I did. That's how I found this article. I thought it was super helpful. And then I went to Gamma, who they're a smaller company. They use AI to just generate slide decks based on a prompt that you give it. First, I just tried copying and pasting the entire article. That didn't work out really well. I didn't really know what I wanted. So then I went through and I went on the slides of what I wanted, and that still didn't work super well. But you can see here's what it gave me for the title page. It didn't even keep my title that I told it straight up. So I thought that was kind of annoying. But and then I really enjoyed the picture of the workers with the hearing protection around their neck and on their ears, because that's really effective, I thought. I don't know. It really emphasizes what I'm going for here. But to get into the article a little bit more, some key definitions for those of you who might not be super familiar with industrial hygiene, key terms. These are some things that I told AI, and it just generated these definitions on its own. So I thought that was really nice. So we got noise. Noise, the key word is unwanted. It's unwanted sound in the workplace that can lead to hearing loss and other health effects. So that's what we're focusing on today. The TWA is the time-weighted average, which is a measure of the average noise exposure over a work shift. And that's supposedly, theoretically, over an entire worker's lifetime. If it's under that, or if the TWA is under the permissible exposure limit, then they will be safe from health effects. And the permissible exposure limit is the limit set by OSHA. For noise, it's 90 decibels over an 8-hour workday. And the action level is another limit set by OSHA that this is the level at which, once it exceeds that, then workplaces have to take action to mitigate exposure. So some background to noise in the workplace. It's one of the most common workplace injuries and workplace hazards that exists. According to this article, it said that there are about 39 million workers in the US that are exposed to noise that can hurt them. And that's about 25% of the US workforce. So that's quite a bit if you think about all the people that are secretaries or have nice office jobs or C-level executives. They don't get exposed to noise, but that includes that. So 1/4 of every worker in the US is exposed to noise. That's a lot. This will lead to often noise-induced hearing loss is the big one. Also, tinnitus is like whirring in the ears or ringing in the ears, and then cardiovascular disease and other workplace injuries, which I thought was interesting that the article said that right at the very beginning, because this whole article is about workplace injuries. And so why is it mentioning it right at the very beginning? So then it explained, which I thought was very helpful. This is on page 2. It says, while the relationship between noise exposure and workplace injuries has been explored, gaps remain in understanding the intricate relationship between the two. Most studies of noise and injury risk have focused on either average exposure levels or specific industries or occupations, thereby limiting their generalizability. So I thought that was interesting. They wanted to dive a little bit deeper into that relationship, which I feel like they did a really good job on. Overall, they had 3 different questions. This is another AI slide. 3 questions that are also found on page 2. 3 questions that they sought to answer. So there's noise metrics and injuries. They want to see how these different noise metrics, specifically more than just the time-weighted average, more than just what everybody else had done, different statistical analysis to those to the level of noise exposure, how that affects injuries. And occupational clusters, are there clusters of occupations or industries that exhibit specific noise exposure characteristics? And cluster risk, do certain clusters of types of noise that workers are being exposed to, do they show a higher risk of injury? The hypotheses that they presented line up with those questions. First, they decided that with these different statistical things that they wanted to do with noise, they decided that they would find the average, the maximum, the noise variability through that standard deviation, and the percentage of work shifts exceeding the action level or PEL, which I thought was interesting. Hypothesis 2, that these clusters exist in occupations, and hypothesis 3 was that the noise exposure clusters have varying risks of fatal and non-fatal injuries. I will say that one of the things about this article that I thought was interesting is I didn't see a whole lot about question 2 and hypothesis 2. That kind of fell by the wayside. I don't know if I need to reread it or if somebody else saw it when they were reading through it, if you read through it before you came. But I feel like they really just focused on 1 and 3, which I thought was really great. I mean, it was awesome, super important and really interesting stuff, but they didn't really touch on the second one too much. So for the methods, they utilized an ecological study with 5 different data sources. They use these data sources to collect data about noise, about injuries, about job occupation, and different things like that. They categorize the noise exposure based on the PEL, like we were talking about, the percentage of exceedance. They did that based on the permissible exposure limit, and then in between the permissible exposure limit and the action level, so that's between 85 and 90 decibels on their time-weighted average. And then below that, they calculated all those different statistical analysis, and then they made, since this is an ecological study, they made different clusters, and they decided on 3 different clusters based on noise levels that they were exposed to in the workplace. So you have cluster 1, that's, probably going to be your safest. Low levels of all metrics, they just call it low exposure. Cluster 2, there's high maximum exposures, significant variability, which was interesting. So there's high maximums, but they saw a lot of peaks and valleys in the data, and a high standard deviation is what that meant. And then cluster 3 is consistently high, while low standard deviation, it was just pretty much always high. So here are some of the results that they cited on their paper. These are found on looks like page 5, if you want to look a little bit closer, and then page 6 is the next one. You can see that there's some interesting things here. What we can see here is that we have 2 different categories. They split it up into occupations and industries, and then they have each different thing. So they have fatalities and then injuries, and they have different kinds of injuries that they thought were important. So they did that for both. And you have your mean, your standard deviation, and maximum, all in incident rate ratios. So as the mean goes up every 5 decibels, this is the incident rate ratio with the confidence interval for the odds of getting a fatality or injury. Which was a really interesting, the difference between occupations and industries. If you think about it, occupation is like an industrial hygienist or like an electrician, and then an industry is like aerospace, nuclear, or finance, or whatever you want to say. So it was really interesting that they decided to split it up like that. You'll see there's some, really we're going to be focusing all upon like on the occupations because that was where all the data was. Industries, it was interesting that it didn't really show much. It was all pretty much just still the same, or not the same, but nothing super remarkable. Here's the graph on page 6, or the results on page 6. This is split up into occupations and industries again. But they split it up into different clusters. So those clusters that we talked about, here's cluster 1 is the square. That's the low everything. The cluster 2 is the volatile high. So that's the circle. And that means that there was high maximums, but there was a high variability in what they had. And then the triangle is the constant high. So high maximums, but low variability. And so you can see that the incidence rate ratio goes up for a lot of these. But you can see the square for the low stays the same. And then you can see that the other 2 go up on pretty much all of them. But then in the industries, they're all pretty unremarkable. They all stay the same. Some outliers or some things that are interesting, chemical burns was high, but it's also very high standard deviation. So there just might not have been a lot of data for that point. They didn't really touch on the chemical burns too much. I don't think they thought it was super important. But just in general, they looked at the fatalities and industries the most. All right, some key results that they brought up in their paper. First, and that's what the picture below is showing in the arrows, is the first bullet point, a significant association between fatal injury rates and higher noise exposure in occupations, especially when you look at mean and maximum TW, time weighted average. So you got your mean right here and your maximum. So we saw that as those went up, both the average and the max went up 5 decibels, the incident rate ratio went up among occupations, statistically significant within that 95% confidence interval. Number 2, the thing that they thought of, or that they talked about, was the volatile high cluster had higher fatality rates than constant high cluster among occupations, which I thought was really interesting. We're all about in industrial hygiene. We're all about the time weighted average. What's the average and what is it over the workplace? But this study found that I gotta move on to the next one so you guys can see it. There. So you can see here that it's not statistically significant, but we can see that it does go up more with the volatile high cluster than just the constant high cluster, which is really fascinating and something that they kind of figured out in this article that is important for occupational safety professionals to know. Some more key results in non-fatal injuries, a higher time-weighted average and frequent exceedance of hazardous noise levels. They were linked to a notable increase in injury rates. So you can see, I forgot to put like a little bracket here, but just all of these, and then especially this top injury one, you can see that with the maximum and for the exceedance, they went up. So that was interesting. And then one more in non-fatal injuries, the volatile high exposure cluster and the constant high exposure had higher injury rates. But again, the volatile high cluster was outpacing the constant high cluster, which is interesting, just a little bit. But again, we're just looking at the occupations. The industries didn't really show much. So these are some of the conclusions that chat gave me, in additions to the ones that we had. Occupational noise exposure is significant for both fatal and non-fatal injuries. It says that, which I agree with this. It's more than just the average, is basically what it's saying. It's average and maximum, as well as exposure variability contribute to the risk of a fatal and a non-fatal injury, which is probably the biggest takeaway from this article, in my opinion. The higher variability was very problematic based on the data we saw, and it advocates for more comprehensive noise assessments, a better way for industrial hygienists. It advocates for a better way for industrial hygienists to measure noise. Here's some of the non-ChatGPT conclusions, meaning just what I thought and what the study said. As we talked about, like they mainly focused on the occupation. And that's just a reminder to all of us that we shouldn't focus so much on where people work or what industry they're in, but we need to focus on them as an individual in their occupation. When you work in construction, you can't treat the worker who's out using the jackhammer the same as the secretary who's in the office building. Although they both work in construction, it's not likely that they're going to have the same exposures. The other thing that was interesting to me that I was just reminded of this is that noise exposure is complicated. And general exposures, occupational exposure to hazards is complicated, but it's more than just the average. If you're doing the minimum of your job, or if you really just want to get the bare basics done, then yeah, get the average and that will give you a good idea. But if you really want to truly characterize what people are being exposed to, then you need to look into more things than that, including the standard deviation, the variability, the maximums, because this is showing us that it's more than just the average, that if we really want to help workers be safe, then we need to look at other stuff. Another AI developed slide. The things that they recommended for future action based on this article was some policy development. That's wishful thinking, in my opinion. The noise permissible exposure limit, most industrial hygienists know is not safe enough, I'd say. But that being said, we can always advocate for better guidelines that develop more statistical analysis than just the TWA. Some intervention strategies, learning how to better handle these exposures to workers, and developing further studies that will study this more in depth. Some limitations to this study. It's an ecological study, so you can't use causal interpretation. Like I'm sure you guys have already thought about, as I always think about whenever I see a study like this, we can't say that that noise means it's dangerous, right? Well, we can't say that maybe they just work in a noisy place and noisy places are more likely to be dangerous, right? It could, like the study says, noise exposure could potentially serve as a proxy for other occupational hazards, such as physical workload, vibration, or chemical exposures, which are common in noisy environments. So we can't definitively say that if we cut out all of the noise, then workers are going to be more safe. But that might be the next step, next study, is if we can figure out some way to develop a better causal pathway between noise and injuries, higher injury rate in the workplace. So here are a few of my questions. How would you have done it differently if you guys were presented with the same data? Or yeah, you guys do have access to the same data. This is all public data. If you guys were to do it differently, what would you do differently? Or what would you do next? And then I'll read the next one too, so that you guys can answer either one. The clusters that they pointed out, they didn't talk at all about the time-weighted average and the percentage of shifts exceeding the PEL. They only talked about maximum and the standard deviation. They didn't touch on the other two things that they had talked about. Do you think this was done on purpose? Would you guys have done the same thing? Would you want to see clusters that include those things? I don't know. Do you think 3 clusters was overly simplistic? I don't know. Any thoughts? Yeah.
I'd be interested in having them do a further breakout of, okay, so there was variability across all the occupations, all the industries, but what are the top 5 or top 10 highest noise exposure industries? Like kind of a more detailed analysis of the highest risk occupations industries.
Yeah, that's true. I know they did mention in the study that for a bunch of their data, they only had one data point of noise to look at, and so that would be nice to figure out what the highest ones were, especially by getting more data for those occupations. So yeah, no, I think that's great.
I guess while I'm speaking, I'll just share a general comment through reflecting on the paper. It just seems like noise is associated with working with big machines, and big machinery tends to kill people, amputate fingers, limbs. So, but I did try to wonder, could there be a causal association where it's not just the exposure to the machinery, it's also the noise is actually somehow interfering with perception of hazards or performance or interesting paper.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because well, last summer I worked for a metal recycling plant, and in the center of the plant they have this huge shredder, right, that literally takes cars up on this big conveyor belt and then dumps it into like a 2-ton, spinning wheel of death. And that's a loud, it really was, it was scary, but that's a loud environment that they're working in, but really it's not hard. Injuries that happened rarely ever were due to them being distracted. It was more bad luck and bad safety protocol. And so it was usually on us as safety professionals to protect them. It wasn't so much like, oh, I was distracted by all this noise. I pressed the wrong button, or I accidentally went where I wasn't supposed to, kind of thing.
Communication can be really challenging in noisy environments. But
yeah,
say if someone's calling for help or needs assistance with something or is trying to ask you a question, even if you hear them asking you a question, if you answer incorrectly, that could put them in a dangerous position as well. If they couldn't fully hear your question or you can't fully hear their answer, it'd be a really big dangerous situation.
Yeah, okay, yeah, great point.
For someone else stop.
Yeah.
I think it would have also been interesting to kind of look at compliance for hearing protection across industries. It's when I was working in a big manufacturing plant, we were required to wear earplugs, but a lot of the mechanics on the line didn't, because they thought it interfered with their ability to talk to other people, and they were all kind of well, we're losing our hearing anyway, might as well.
Yeah.
So I think that would kind of be an interesting metric.
Yeah, to that point, I was kind of thinking that would be where I would want to go next. They didn't really even touch on the fact that, some people were probably wearing their hearing protection versus not, which would be very interesting to know if hearing protection is protecting against some of these errors that people can make. Because yeah, you can get distracted by all the noise, but also if you have hearing protection and you're not seeing alarms, you're not hearing other people, to your point. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, the one thing that just I thought about just today when you were talking was that you've got a lot of times you look at exposure to noise and then outcome of hearing loss, or in this case outcome of fatality, right? For me, I'm more interested in noise exposure changing behavior, right? So this noise exposure causes me to not hear, to communicate differently, or that I can't hear other people, or I choose to do this instead of that because I can't of the noise, or what does the noise cause a person to do that then makes them more at risk or less at risk?
Yeah.
In their work environment, and then you have the fatality, or then you have these, right? So for me, the next step, and they're probably, I'd like to think there's industrial hygiene research that does exposure, and then what does a person do next? Right? Yeah. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the literature, but that's where my mind would go in terms of this. It'd be okay, what's intervening between this exposure and this outcome of fatality, or exposure, or the outcome of hearing loss, right? Is it, and some of that is the hearing protection, right? Okay, we have this exposure. Now we introduce hearing protection and we have fewer of these, hearing loss outcomes. Well, what else is going on in there?
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Sounds like we need some occupational psychologists on that. Yeah.
Maybe. I think it's a good idea.
No, I think that's a great idea. And actually, oh yeah, go ahead, Bubba.
Micah from online has a question. Would reporting the standard error of the mean between industries as well as standard deviation give more detailed comparison about industry differences?
Yeah, thanks, Micah. Yeah, I mean, I don't see why not. That would work, I think, as a great article to follow this. You know, I don't think they had their different key points that they wanted to focus on, but I think if they were to follow up on this and kind of explore, dive deeper into that, kind of like we're talking about comparing industries, I think that would be a perfect next step for them. But for whatever reason, they didn't do it here. I think they've got lots of really good data that they can dive into later, you know.
Presentation. One observation is, I agree with Ryan and others, and that comment is in the middle of the limitations paragraph. It doesn't lead out. Of course, normally you should lead out the strongest issues.
Yeah.
Can you backtrack to the chat? These are really minor points. Can you back to the chat GPT summary first bullet? Yeah, I didn't know you had it, I think.
Which one?
Not way back at the beginning, but and you're towards the end. You have chat GPT and then you have not.
Oh, the conclusion. Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. First bullet. Yeah. So the second sentence, anybody notice is this correctly worded based on the study, basically?
Contributes.
Yeah, exactly. That's the problem. I would better word. Associated with.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah,
Next.
you're right.
What we're trying to do is really help people really hone and really good critiquing skills and use of words is important. Next slide. And yes, there's one other one at the end of the slide. Whoop.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Better to have a different term.
On the fourth bullet point right here.
Yep. Yeah. Dr. Thies would point this out if he was in the room. Intent. Associate factor, again, not a risk factor. Risk factor implies causality, right? So minor points, but I'm just trying.
Yeah. No.
You did a very good job.
Yeah, so that's
Minor but meaningful.
Yeah, it's important to pay attention to the words, and the internet doesn't. It's slop all over them. A lot of scientific articles don't either.
Yeah, especially AI. I feel like one of the biggest issues with it is that kind of just like word salads. You know, it takes like that's Dr. Thies's biggest thing. Sometimes I feel like in his class he's like, when you say a word, know what it means and use it correctly, right? And so I feel like AI is the opposite of that.
AI uses common language, right?
Mhm.
And it's been programmed to think that synonyms actually mean the same thing but we know that even when we're looking at a synonym, sometimes one is stronger than the other in how we would interpret it, right? As a human. So we can't just interchange them, completely. And that's kind of what happens, not in terms of human writers and ChatGPT will do this. They'll use a word that is just slightly not right, right? This, not the, risk factor, it's slightly not right, because it suggests a causal relationship when it's really what the data allows us to do is association, right? So, and ChatGPT is not quite smart enough to figure that out.
Yeah, not yet. And to finish, just because I put it in here, so I want to show you guys. This was what I told chat. We don't have to answer these questions, but I thought it presented some really interesting questions. I had to do this twice because the first time it still gave me kind of not great questions. And so I said, focus your questions on the viability of the data, study, and methods. So these are two questions that it gave that honestly made me think about the study a little bit harder. And, and then the best part is you can ask chat what it thinks about it. So that was kind of what I did. And yeah, thank you guys.
Tanner, come on down. Put it on, put it on, and then you go and turn it on. And then this goes forward to down. Down is forward. Yep.
Testing, testing. Okay, I'm Tanner. Welcome to Journal Club. I'm a first year IH student. Decided to do my study on this 2019 study, which is the effects on resident work hours, sleep duration, work experienced in a randomized order safety trial evaluating resident physician schedules or rosters, which is basically meaning they were looking at variability in changing the shifts of the residents and seeing how that affected their work and their health and the patient effects as well. So why care about this study? Why did anyone go through with doing this study like this? Because sleep affects basically every aspect of our lives, and there's a lot of ways to optimize health and productivity if we have more research done in this area, and these ideas can be implemented into any occupational area, any area of employment, not just healthcare. And I'm just incredibly passionate about sleep myself as well. So I figured why not try and learn a little bit more about how this works. Shout out to the occupational medicine residents if they're listening online. You guys are awesome. Hopefully you guys are getting enough sleep and doing okay. The purpose of the study. So again, they were trying to see if they had more structured work schedules, how that would change things in their work and in their lives outside of work as well. And they measured their work schedules across 6 different work sites, and we'll talk more about that later, but that could have been a potential limitation. Maybe they could have had more. So new doctors can be incredibly sleep deprived. They have ACGME that says that they can work a max of 80 hours per week. But this is often underreported because they're not trying to get their residency program in trouble. So they're encouraged sometimes to underreport. They also frequently take call and do lots of work outside of hospital hours that might not be accounted for. And in extreme cases, they can work 100 to 130 hours a week. They have sometimes a fear of repercussion for reporting these work hours because they don't want to be labeled as a complainer and again protect their program's reputation. And obviously there's a necessary component too to putting in this many work hours so they can have enough experience from the residency training to become competent practitioners as well. So that's one of the big questions that this study was trying to ask is, would physicians in training be able to undergo less training or at least have different shifts scheduled and still become competent? And how would the outcomes change for both trained practitioners and patients? And what future adjustments and what future studies can be had? So the idea was that the scheduling can decrease burnout rates. Physicians have a pretty high rate of burnout just because they do often work so much. Obviously, if they have better scheduled rosters or shifts, they can have better circadian rhythms. So they're going to be healthier. They're going to have better memory, better long-term potentiation, and just memory storage. And they were trying to find out if they found any objective measurable improvements in health and training outcomes as well as patient outcomes. So healthcare involves a lot of unpredictable long work hours. And we all know what happens if you work a very, very long shift. You get fatigued, you get brain fog, you don't end up performing like you optimally would had you been well rested, perfectly rested. And in worst case scenarios, this can lead to medical errors. So that was another idea, is to try and reduce the amount of medical errors. So will we see residents being able to kind of have their cake and eat it too, win best of both worlds, be healthier, have better patient outcomes, better training results? How does implementing structured work schedules improve the staff well-being? How does it schedule implementation affect the patient outcome? What challenges might arise from these new schedule implementations? Because it might cause problems in itself if you're trying to change things too much compared to how things have been historically. And then key factors that will influence successful implementation. This slide, I put something in there twice because it was just that important, apparently. There would be improved staff well-being and better patient outcomes on there twice, and then more uniform schedules. We're expected to get better results on all fronts. Goal of the study, they wanted to eventually come up with some evidence-based recommendations for administrators on whether more structured schedules are worth implementing, and identify what works in scheduling and what would end up causing more problems or just not be helpful at all. There haven't been a ton of studies on this yet, so this was a study from 2019, I believe. There is a lot of anecdote from older physicians, and not all of it is a bad thing either, because there's a big necessity that young doctors have in training to actually make sure that they get enough hours under the belt in order to become fully trained. So it's a legitimate concern from attendings as well that the younger doctors do get enough hours in, such as they want to have sufficient emphasis on training. Some attendings do have the sink or swim mentality, like either you're built for it or you're not. And then there's also the we did it, so should you. So that's kind of been a little bit part of the resistance to change in terms of perhaps changing resident physician training hours. But either way, we should give at least more consideration to see if better outcomes could be had in the future. Okay, so they were divided into two main groups. So you have these two groups. So the EDWR is the extended duration work roster, which involved shifts that were 24 hours or greater. And then you had the RCWR, or the rapid cycling work roster, which was shifts of less than 16 hours. Yeah, those are two main groups. 302 physicians monitored in 371-month pediatric intensive care unit, or PICU, rotations across 6 medical centers. Work hours and subjective sleep data, that's supposed to say, were collected via electronic diary. So they had more objective methods of data collection, as well as the subjective daily electronic diary collection. Some info about actigraphy here. So it is a non-invasive technique that measures their activity over periods of days to weeks. They asked them, in this case, to wear their wristwatch on a non-dominant hand. You guys are probably familiar with things like actigraphy or HRV, if you have any watches or rings that measure these types of metrics. Just some examples of common actigraphy technologies. So we have the Oura Ring, the Fitbit, and the Huawei Honor Band. And then they're just fancy computer algorithms to determine if someone's awake or not. We have, so the Whoop Band, if you guys are familiar with that, this one's pretty common too. That uses HRV, which I don't have them in the slides, but that is the time in milliseconds that it takes for your heart to adjust. So it's like the time adjustment in between heartbeats. And generally, if you have a higher HRV, then you're going to have a better capability of recovering, or you're going to be less stressed. So that's a little bit different from the actigraphy. But still a similar concept to track sleep patterns and health. So this is the actual brand that they had them wear, which was the wrist motion letter actigraph from Ambulatory Monitoring Inc. Yeah, to track their activity. They were also asked this Berlin questionnaire before participating in the study to determine if whether they had any symptoms of sleep apnea or just feelings of tiredness. I think this is fairly readable, but it's asking about snoring and how frequently, and asking about falling asleep at inappropriate times. And then it went on to ask more general health questions, I believe. So the demographics of the study, they were generally second, third year white residents around 29 years old, BMI of 23. So this is a more rhetorical question. Could we have had a more diverse population participating? Yes, and there were only 6 sites studied, so we could have had potentially more sites studied. It's pretty hard in practice, I guess, to have a whole bunch of different sites involved, but that could have been a strength too, to potentially add more, depending on how convoluted it would become. And then this is showing the effectiveness of their data collection. So you can see that there's 413 total rotations. We had some people observe, some people withdrew, and then you have the 2 main groups split up. I didn't mean to have that covered right there. But both groups, so you have the extended duration and the rapid cycling roster. And then at the bottom, you can see usable data numbers are fairly high. So the data collection was relatively successful, I would say, in terms of how many people were first involved at the beginning of the study. And this is going to be pretty hard for you guys to see, but the you can see the gist of it. So you have the 6 sites, you have the 2 groups, the extended duration and the rapid cycling work roster. The black bars are sleep and the gray bars represent shifts. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, because I might have just misinterpreted this, but it looks like to me that if you're looking at the same group and the same site, that there's some pretty uniform data there, but then from group to group and site to site, there's fairly varying data, which is what you might expect. Some more comparisons. So we have the actigraphy data, the more objective, and then we had the more subjective e-diary recordings. And then what this looks like is that since we have a statistically significant p-value, you're going to have a significant more amount of hours per sleep. And subjectively, sleep is increased as well. And then if you look at this top question with me right here. So it says, to what extent did the training this year offer you the opportunity to gain skills and knowledge? Then you have these 2 groups right here, the extended duration and the rapid cycling. And you have a high p-value here. So what that seemed to me was that these residents that were in the rapid cycling work roster group felt that they were adequately trained, even with shorter shifts and having more time to sleep. I had some questions for ChatGPT. ChatGPT is very smart, actually, and it helped me catch something that I did not catch when reading through the study. I'm not going to read this whole thing off, but you guys can if you want. The main thing that I had missed actually when reading through the study was that the rapid cycling work roster residents they had to work 25% more overall because of the decrease in hours and because of the way their shifts were, including how handoffs work and how the shift change works. So that was a very actually interesting insight that I had completely missed. Overall, the RCWR shorter shifts were better off because of better quality sleep, more sleep, less burnout, and they have fewer signs of mental fatigue. They had less fatigue-induced errors, and one thing that I think was pretty notable is that these extended duration residents had an increased amount of medical errors. Remember, the extended duration is the shifts that are 24 hours or greater, so you could imagine that would be something you might expect. The rapid cycling group did have less clinical exposure, and more studies still need to be done, especially when considering certain medical specialties, especially surgical specialties. We don't know if it would be enough training for these specific specialties. One good interesting thing is that there was no significant difference in board certification rates. I thought that was very interesting. They were well rested. Both subjectively think that they got enough training, and the rapid cycling group, again, as we mentioned before, did have to work 25% more. So that was one of the main drawbacks, I guess you could say, to the rapid cycling group, was that they did feel like they had to work a whole lot harder. So that was one of the things that they reported on the survey that they were not as satisfied with. So some more conclusions. We confirmed that the residents would be well off with 16-hour shifts in terms of sleep, well-being, and that they did pass all their boards. And we need to have more studies, I think, especially for different specialties within medicine, to see if this would actually be a viable continuation. Some limitations. Again, only 6 sites were studied. They each scheduled their own ways, like we saw, and it was not standardized. So that's something that could potentially be revisited in the future. It was only following residents in the pediatric intensive care unit, so you could have looked at any other ICU or any other hospital area. We could have had more physicians be involved. Could have had sites that were participating that were already inclined to maybe having shorter shifts participating. That may have confounded things, I'm not sure. And then a lot of the data that was reported was pretty subjective, so maybe some more objective measurements could have been had too, besides just the actigraphy. They also could have had, I think, of a potentially longer follow-up period. I think it was only tracking for maybe a month, it sounds like. And then, yeah, I could have been tracking them for a longer period of time. This part, so you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there was a control group, because the extended duration group wouldn't have been, because they were just assigned a long shift, whereas a control group would have just been the residents just working whichever shift they would have been working regardless beforehand. So for a lot of reasons, it's not transferable to healthcare settings or all healthcare settings and other occupational settings. So we need more studies because of that too. And then I made a list of other potential areas we could have in other occupations. We could have more studies be done on shift work and sleep and tracking work rosters and everything. So just quickly, hospital staff, emergency services, transportation, manufacturing, customer service, education, IT, research, oil, mining, agriculture, law enforcement, and health and wellness. Could be pretty applicable, especially because a lot of these are things that involve hours outside of your typical 9 to 5 and involve shift work. And this is incredibly relevant. This is Vessel from the band Sleep Token. He's an honest. How many of you know Sleep Token by raise of hands? 1, 2. You guys are awesome. The rest of you, go check out Sleep Token. They're awesome. They're incredible. Again, very relevant, I know. Thank you. Appreciate you guys. Questions? Yes.
So this group about 20 years ago produced a bunch of evidence that extended work shifts for residents were not good for sleep and safety and patient quality. And our physicians may know better than I, but my understanding was that there was a policy enacted restricting extended work shifts, and then it was reversed. So this feels like phase 2, demonstrating the sleep and health effects of extended work shifts. So I'm pretty sure the extended work shift condition is usual practice in most hospitals. So the lack of a control group, it was really already a usual practice control group, and the rapid cycling was the proposed better alternative.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. That's okay. Perfect. Makes sense.
A good summary of it. This started with Libby Zion in the 1980s in New York State with an allegation that the problem was the result of the shift work. So they put in an 80-hour limit. Is what happened. And then RCTs were performed in the 20 teens, and there are multiple RCTs, and they do not clearly align to the 80-hour rule. So they've now relaxed the rules since that point in time. I don't know. I haven't looked at the last year or two to see if something else has gone the other direction. But anyway, short of it, that's what the history is here. And I'll give you a little bit of rationale because it may not be apparent. This is an ICU. ICUs, things happen rapidly, naturally. And so if you are not there, then you've got a problem in terms of how do you make adjustments and how do you properly make a decision making and make the right intervention. And if it fails, what do you do next? Because if you switch out all the time, then you lose potentially that aspect of training. So that's one of the problems which occurs with shorter 40-hour work week kind of things. The other thing is when you graduate, what happens when you go in the real world? Are there limits? Of course not. If your neighbor is sick, you're going to get out of bed and help your neighbor. And it's the same thing in hospitals. So that's the problem now, is that they then function sleep deprived on the job after graduation, after you're protected in residency, and you don't have the benefit of having somebody else to pick up after you. So there's a lot of stuff here. It's very controversial.
It's a great point. Yeah, I think, and then maybe it depends on which specialty they go into as well, depending on how many hours they're working on as an attending to. But yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, like neurosurgery, guess what? Friday night, Saturday night.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Labor Day.
Great point. Yeah.
Maybe a bit of a broader question, given that we know that people who have not slept enough make poorer decisions than people who have slept enough, maybe there would just be an incentive to extend the amount of time for residency. So people get the same amount of training, but they do it in more time. Those people get more sleep. And then, perhaps we even increase the number of physicians that would graduate each year, right? So that seems like maybe there's like a supply and demand issue. Like maybe more physicians is the answer to, working less hours, but still maintaining, good technical practices and things like that.
Both great points. Yeah. Need more doctors. And then, I'd be curious to see what our doctors think about extending training beyond what it already is. So I'm not sure, but
The resident thinks it's a good idea. Very supportive.
yeah,
Yeah.
great points though. Yeah.
Many of the professors are in favor of longer, in many specialties are in favor of longer residencies. Money is the big issue. Medicare pays for most of the training in the United States. It's already underwater. So good luck getting that out of Congress. I'll just add another 2 cents. So I have students reading one of the older Barger papers where physicians following working these extreme extended shifts are getting in more crashes on their commute home from work. And there's a separate paper that there's more patient errors when there are extended work shifts. And this particular paper shows the rapid cycling shift schedule is producing longer sleep duration. And so, just in general, our human physiology, we're not built to work at night and be awake at the night. All of our physiology is working against this. So we're working upstream from human health and well-being anytime we persist in working shift work. So it's really tricky business when we have operations that require or where we want 24-hour service, like if we need a neurosurgeon on Labor Day. This group has done really rigorous work on this particular topic, and in general, extended work shifts are not good for physicians or patients. So yeah, I guess just a little pitch for paying attention to circadian biology, and the more we fight against it, the more we're going to run into health and performance problems. But to Kurt's point, it is more expensive you need more physicians to fill out the schedule if you're not working the extended work shifts. So it's a real financial challenge and operational challenge.
Yeah, great points. Great points. And so, yeah, it's like what other studies can be done to find out what we can do to solve this problem? Because it seems like it's going to be perpetually, and it has been a problem for a long, long time.
So question on, you mentioned increased sample size, and everybody's gonna say, yes, that's a good idea. What would the IRB say about that? That's to everybody.
Possibly, like, you want to increase your sample size, maybe you need to go outside of your own IRB, right? So you like need a couple different IRBs to cover a couple different institutions, and now maybe it really complicates data collection as you do.
True, but it's all surmountable. Is there any hazard? The IRB say there's a hazard.
To be concerned about impact on patient outcomes,
Keep going.
expand how much of the hospital is involved in the study, and this goes through multiple departments potentially.
So that's one of the arguments that could be made in the IRB. Give me your sample size. What are you expecting as a difference? And we shouldn't unnecessarily expose too many people to your experiment because it may have harms to people. See? So your idea is good, but I can easily see an IRB pushing back rather strongly actually against that.
Well, that's why in the IRB, they often want you to put a description of your study and in many cases, your justification for that sample size, right? Including power statistics potentially and things like that, particularly if it goes to the full IRB, which something like this probably would because of the patient, connection and so forth. And so if you show that to statistically analyze your data, that you need X number of people, and you say, I want to collect 3 or 4 times that, they're going to say no. They're going to say, why? What is your justification for more than what is necessary to test your hypotheses? Because of the risk that it presents to patients and others. So
Fair.
that's usually only going to happen on a full board review where you have other experts who do research who might look at it. Whereas in an exempt protocol, they're not as concerned about that. Maybe they should be, but they aren't as concerned because you're not getting an expert on there.
This would surely be not expedited.
Yeah.
This is an experiment on people. About people. So unfortunately, Dr. Olson stepped out, but this is one of those cases where I'm showing a lot of data. Otherwise, we're actually going to agree to disagree. I would agree that the issue that, physiology and all that sort of stuff would argue about the shift length and the sleep and that sort of thing, but the patient outcomes, no. the body of evidence has been against that, that there's a material difference, which is why they've actually been relaxing the 80-hour rule, not enforcing it. Because the other thing that's gone on is with the 80-hour rule, as soon as you enforce a rule, guess what happens when it comes towards the end of your 80 hours? They'll start playing games and they don't take care of the patient, and there's, I'll leave them in the emergency room longer. Let's go have them order some tests, and it's somebody else's problem. All kinds of stuff that should never happen starts happening because it's a game. You gamified it.
Yeah, interesting point. So I guess, would you guys say then maybe we keep the same sample size for future studies, but potentially just have different populations then?
Well, okay, what did Einstein say about reproducing studies and expecting a different result? Usually doesn't happen, right? So you really have to materially change your experimental design. I would not measure, I would not measure test scores, but I would think about other patient quality metrics, because it may get in, some of those may be specific enough, but a lot of that's categorical data. It's hard to get power.
Fair.
So I didn't really answer your question.
That's okay. Complicated. Other questions?
All right, we'll call it. That's time. Great job.